Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. When my grandfather was a young man, he served as a soldier during the Vietnam War. The story he told me was unlike any other war story I'd ever heard. It wasn't just about the horrors of battle, but something far more sinister, an encounter with the dead that he could never forget. This is his story. The year was 1968. Deep in the heart of the Vietnam War, my grandfather, David, along with 11 other soldiers, was part of a reconnaissance team tasked with patrolling a dense jungle area near the Cambodian border. The mission was simple on paper: 3 days and 2 nights of gathering intel on enemy movements, and then return to base. But as they prepared for the mission, there was an eerie tension in the air. David and his team gathered in their barracks, preparing for the journey ahead. The weather was hot and sticky, typical of the jungle, but that day, it felt heavier than usual. The humidity clung to their skin like a suffocating blanket, and even the insects seemed quieter than usual. It was as if the jungle itself knew something ominous was about to happen. Captain Reynolds, the squad leader, briefed the team. "We'll be setting up a base camp near the old village ruins, then moving further into the jungle to scout the area. Keep your eyes open. The locals have been talking about strange things happening out there. Just remember, our enemy is human, not ghosts. Stay focused." But David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. The old village ruins, which the locals called Kuvuk by Bo Quen, translated to the Forgotten Zone, were said to be haunted. The villagers believed it to be cursed, and rumors spread about ghostly soldiers still patrolling its paths long after their death. These stories, dismissed as superstition, now weighed heavy on David's mind. They left the base at dawn, the sun barely peeking through the thick jungle canopy. The air was dense with the smell of wet earth and decaying foliage, and every footstep seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. The men moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. As they approached the ruins, the jungle seemed to swallow them whole. Towering trees blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving them in a strange, dim twilight even though it was midday. The village ruins were overgrown with vines and moss, crumbling stone buildings long abandoned to the jungle. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional call of distant animals or the rustle of leaves in the wind. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Jackson, one of the younger soldiers. "Feels like we're not alone out here." David felt it too, like eyes were watching them from the shadows, though no one could be seen. It was more than just the typical paranoia of a soldier on edge. There was something wrong here. The air felt thick with unseen forces, and every instinct in David's body screamed that they were walking into danger. They set up camp just outside the ruins, their tents barely visible under the dense foliage. As night began to fall, the atmosphere grew even more unsettling. The jungle, usually alive with the sounds of insects and nocturnal animals, had gone eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a twig or the rustling of leaves in the distance, too far away to be human, but close enough to be heard. The men gathered around a small fire, the orange glow flickering against their tense faces. They exchanged nervous glances, none of them wanting to admit what they were all feeling, that something was wrong. "Hey, Reynolds," said Carter, one of the more experienced soldiers. "What's the deal with this place? Why do the locals avoid it?" Reynolds hesitated, poking the fire with a stick before speaking. "They say it's haunted. Soldiers who died here in the early days of the war, both American and Vietnamese, never left. The villagers claim they still patrol the jungle at night, reliving their final moments over and over again." The men shifted uncomfortably at the mention of ghosts. Though none of them believed in the supernatural, they couldn't deny the oppressive weight of the place. Even the fire seemed weaker here, as if the very air was draining its strength. "Well, "I don't believe in ghosts," Jackson said, trying to sound brave, but his voice cracked slightly. "It's just stories. We've got a job to do." Reynolds nodded, though David noticed that even he looked uneasy. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we move deeper into the jungle." That night, David lay in his tent, unable to sleep. The silence outside was suffocating, and the jungle seemed to press in on them from all sides. He stared up at the canvas roof of the tent, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. His mind kept replaying the stories he'd heard about this place, the ghost soldiers, the patrols that never returned. Then, just as he began to drift off, he heard a faint rustling sound, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen. The sound was getting closer, too steady to be an animal. David grabbed his rifle and crept out of his tent, careful not to wake the others. In the dim light of the fire, he saw shadows moving in the trees. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized there were figures, dozens of them, walking silently through the jungle. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and as they came closer, David's blood ran cold. They were soldiers, but not alive. Their uniforms were tattered, their skin pale and lifeless. Some had horrific wounds, gashes across their faces, missing limbs, yet they walked as if nothing was wrong. Their eyes were empty, staring straight ahead as they marched in formation through the jungle, unaware of David's presence. He watched in horror as they passed by, a silent parade of the dead. The stories were true. The ghosts of fallen soldiers still patrolled these jungles, trapped in an eternal march. David stumbled back into his tent, heart racing, unable to process what he had just seen. As he lay there, shaking, he knew that, whatever they had walked into, it was far more dangerous than any enemy they had ever faced. Tomorrow, they would have to venture deeper into the jungle, and David wasn't sure if any of them would make it out alive. Night settled in like a heavy fog, cloaking the jungle in darkness so thick it felt like they were at the bottom of a deep well. The small campfire in the center of the group cast weak, flickering light, barely reaching the surrounding trees, which loomed like silent sentinels in the oppressive blackness. The thick canopy above swallowed any trace of moonlight, leaving the men stranded in what felt like an impenetrable void. David sat by the fire with his rifle cradled in his lap, eyes scanning the trees for any movement. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig in the distance made him jump. The others were equally on edge. Jackson, one of the younger soldiers, paced nervously near the perimeter, his flashlight occasionally cutting through the thick darkness, though it seemed more a comfort than an effective tool. The jungle, which during the day had been alive with the constant hum of insects and the calls of birds, was now disturbingly quiet. It was as if every living creature had fled, leaving the jungle in complete, unnatural silence. Only the sound of their own breathing and the crackling fire broke the stillness. Carter, who had taken the first watch with David, spoke in a low voice. "There's something wrong with this place. I've been on 100 patrols, but this one, it doesn't feel right." David nodded, unable to shake the eerie feeling that had settled in his gut since the moment they arrived. "It's too quiet. I don't like it." As they sat there, the darkness seemed to press in closer, the air growing heavier, more stifling. Even the fire struggled to stay alight, the flames flickering weakly as if something was sucking the life out of them. It was as though the jungle itself was closing in, watching, waiting. Just then, a faint sound broke the silence. Footsteps soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. David tensed, his grip tightening on his rifle. The others froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. It came from the direction of the ruins, where earlier they had felt the presence of something unseen. "Do you hear that?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely a breath. David nodded, his pulse quickening. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was walking just beyond the edge of the camp. But there were no flashlights, No signs of human movement, just the steady, slow crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. Then, out of the corner of his eye, David saw a shadow moving between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight. His heart pounded in his chest as he squinted into the darkness. It was a figure, a man, but something was wrong. The way it moved was too stiff, too mechanical, like it wasn't fully in control of its own body. "Who's out there?" Carter hissed, raising his rifle. The figure didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the question. It just kept moving closer, stepping into the dim light of the campfire. David's breath caught in his throat as he saw the figure clearly for the first time. It was a soldier, dressed in an old, tattered uniform, but his face it was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, with an emptiness that made David's blood run cold. "Jesus Christ," Jackson whispered, stepping back. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could react, more figures began to emerge from the shadows, stepping silently into the light. They were all soldiers American, Vietnamese dressed in the uniforms of the dead. Some had gaping wounds, others were missing limbs, yet they moved with an eerie calm, as if they didn't even feel the injuries that should have killed them. Their hollow eyes stared straight ahead, devoid of any emotion or recognition. David's heart raced as he realized what they were seeing: the ghosts of the fallen, the lost souls of soldiers who had died here, still patrolling the jungle long after their bodies had rotted away. These weren't just spirits, they were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over again. Suddenly, the fire sputtered and nearly went out, plunging the camp into near total darkness. Panic surged through the men as they scrambled to relight it, their hands shaking, fear gripping them tightly. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that their breath came out in visible puffs. It felt like death itself was creeping toward them. "Get the fire going," Reynolds barked, his voice trembling as he fumbled with his lighter. "Keep them back." But the figures kept coming, silent and relentless, their dead eyes fixed on the soldiers huddled by the dying fire. Carter raised his rifle, aiming at the closest apparition, but David grabbed his arm. "No," David hissed. "Don't shoot. It won't do anything. They're already dead." The figures stopped just outside the ring of light, standing motionless, their heads slowly turning as if they were surveying the living. One of them, an American soldier with half his face blown off, locked eyes with David. For a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just him and the dead man, staring at each other across the veil of life and death. David's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel something pulling at him, a cold, suffocating force that made it hard to breathe, as if the dead were trying to drag him into their world. His vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he could hear voices, whispers in the wind, calling his name. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the jungle's dense undergrowth. The sound of their footsteps slowly faded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, though the fear lingered like a thick fog. No one spoke for a long time. The fire finally roared back to life, casting an uneasy glow over the camp, but the men remained on edge, their eyes darting to the jungle, half expecting the dead soldiers to return at any moment. David sat back down, his hands shaking, his mind racing. They still had 2 more nights out here, and he wasn't sure if any of them would survive it. The hours of the night stretched on, and with each passing minute, the weight of the jungle seemed to grow heavier. The once vibrant sounds of the wilderness were swallowed by an eerie, oppressive silence that gnawed at the nerves of every man. Despite the brief, chilling encounter earlier, the night dragged into the deepest hours, where fatigue began to take hold. David and Carter sat by the fire, eyes wide open, unable to shake off the memory of those hollow-eyed soldiers' ghosts from a war long past. The other men, exhausted but terrified, took turns trying to sleep, though most couldn't close their eyes without reliving what they'd seen. Jackson, who was assigned to take the next watch, shifted uncomfortably near the edge of the clearing, his flashlight tracing the dark tree line. "I hate this place," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. David, still gripping his rifle, glanced toward him, noticing how pale Jackson looked. "Just hang in there," he said, trying to sound calm, but even he could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around his throat. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows that danced and flickered among the trees. But no matter how warm the flames were, the cold of the jungle pressed in. It wasn't a natural cold, it was something else, something deeper. A chill that came from the presence of things unseen. The hours crawled by, and slowly, the fire began to die down. The men huddled closer together, trying to stay warm, trying to stay sane. But even as they tried to keep their spirits up, there was an undeniable sense that something was still out there, watching them from the darkness. David's heart raced with every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. His senses were heightened, and the jungle felt like it was breathing around them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he glanced towards the tree line, half expecting the dead soldiers to return. And then it happened. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, so strong that it nearly put out the fire. The jungle around them seemed to come alive with movement, branches shaking, leaves rustling, but no animal sounds, no voices, nothing but the whisper of the wind. Jackson froze, his flashlight beam suddenly flickering wildly. "Did you see that?" he whispered urgently. David looked toward where Jackson was pointing, and his heart skipped a beat. In the dim light of the flashlight, something moved just beyond the trees. It wasn't clear, just a shadow too fast to identify, too fleeting to catch, but it was there, lurking. "What was it?" Carter asked, standing up and gripping his weapon tightly. "I don't know," Jackson stammered. "It was something big. It moved fast." The men scrambled to their feet, rifles raised, eyes scanning the dark. But the shadow was gone, swallowed by the jungle. The fire, now weak and low, barely provided any light. David felt his stomach drop as a low, distant sound reached their ears. At first, it was hard to make out, but it grew louder, a rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. It wasn't coming from just one direction, it seemed to surround them, coming from the jungle itself. "Everyone, stay sharp," David ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. The men spread out, forming a defensive circle, rifles pointing into the trees. Then, out of the corner of his eye, David saw it again. A figure moving through the trees, slow and deliberate, but this time, it wasn't alone. More shadows began to emerge, moving toward the camp in eerie silence. There were at least a dozen of them, their forms barely visible in the dim light. David's pulse quickened. He knew they weren't alive. These weren't soldiers of the living, but of the dead. The figures came closer, and as they stepped into the edge of the firelight, David could see them clearly. They were soldiers, some dressed in the tattered remnants of American uniforms, others in the garb of the Vietnamese. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. But what was most disturbing was the way they moved, slow, methodical, like they were on patrol, were living the same mission they had died on. "No way," Reynolds muttered under his breath, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Not again." The dead soldiers walked past them, completely ignoring the living men as if they weren't even there. One by one, they marched into the clearing, their boots silent on the dirt, their eyes staring straight ahead at nothing. David held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The dead soldiers were close enough to touch, but none of the living dared move. It was as if the very act of acknowledging the spirits might break the fragile boundary between their world and the afterlife. The air grew colder, the fire now barely more than embers. David could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around him, his body frozen in place. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the dead soldiers began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows once more. But the jungle was not done with them yet. Just as the last figure disappeared into the night, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was a sound of pure agony, the kind of scream that could only come from someone or something that had experienced unimaginable pain. David spun around, trying to locate the source of the scream, but the jungle remained still, silent once more. The men exchanged horrified glances, their faces pale with fear. What the hell was that? Carter whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. I don't know, David replied, his voice trembling. But whatever it is, it's not done with us. The jungle closed in around them, the darkness thickening, and the men could feel the presence of something far more malevolent than just the ghosts of dead soldiers. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for them, and it was watching. The oppressive silence after the scream felt unbearable. The jungle, once alive with the soft hum of insects and rustling leaves, was now deathly quiet. Every soldier's breath was shallow, every movement slow and calculated. David could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, like invisible hands wrapping around his chest, squeezing. What do we do? Dave, Carter whispered, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. He wasn't alone in his fear. Every man in the patrol was now on edge, gripped by the tension of the unknown. David swallowed hard, the cold sweat beading on his forehead. We stay together, he said firmly, his voice just loud enough for the others to hear. No one goes off alone. We hold this position until dawn. But deep down, David wasn't sure they would make it that long. The presence in the jungle felt malicious, like something ancient had awakened, and it was drawn to them. It wasn't just the ghosts of fallen soldiers haunting this place. Something far worse lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting. The fire had all but died, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dirt. The men huddled together, backs to one another, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The air was thick with dread, and the feeling of being watched had only intensified since the ghostly patrol had passed. Jackson, still standing near the edge of the clearing, strained his ears. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice barely audible. David listened, at first hearing nothing but the pounding of his own heart. But then, faintly, there it was again, the rhythmic thumping they had heard earlier, like distant footsteps, only now it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the sound of men marching. This was something else entirely. David's grip tightened on his rifle. Get ready. Suddenly, the tree line burst to life. Dark shapes darted between the trees, too fast to track. The growl grew louder, more distinct, a deep rumble that shook the ground beneath their feet. The soldiers scrambled to position themselves, rifles raised and aimed at the unseen enemy. Show yourself, Carter yelled, his voice trembling as he scanned the darkness. But instead of a direct assault, the figures remained in the shadows, circling them, closing in slowly. The growling grew closer, and for the first time, David saw something, a glint of eyes, reflecting the faint light of the embers. They were not human. A shape moved forward, stepping into the clearing. It was large, hunched, and covered in matted fur. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing with an unnatural light. The creature resembled a wolf, but stood upright, its limbs twisted and elongated. It snarled, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth, saliva dripping from its maw. Oh, God, Reynolds muttered under his breath, stumbling backward. David raised his rifle, heart racing, opened fire. The night erupted in gunfire, the sound of bullets tearing through the jungle. The creature let out a deafening roar and lunged at them, moving faster than any of the men could anticipate. It slammed into Jackson, sending him sprawling to the ground. His scream was cut short as the beast's claws tore into him. Jackson, David yelled, but there was no time to help. The other soldiers opened fire, bullets whizzing through the air. but the creature barely flinched. The men fell back, panic setting in as more creatures appeared from the shadows. There were at least 3 of them, each more monstrous than the last, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They moved like predators, circling their prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. David fired again, aiming for the closest one, but his bullets seemed to have little effect. "What the hell are these things?" he shouted, backing toward the center of the clearing. "They're not human," Carter screamed, barely holding his rifle steady. Reynolds, panting heavily, fumbled with his ammunition. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay here." But there was nowhere to run. The jungle was alive with the sounds of the creatures, their growls and roars echoing through the trees. David knew that if they ran, they would be picked off one by one. Their only chance was to stand and fight, no matter how slim that chance was. Suddenly, the largest of the creatures lunged at David. He barely had time to react, diving out of the way as its massive claws slashed through the air where he had just stood. The beast snarled, turning its glowing eyes toward him, and David felt a wave of terror wash over him. It was then that he realized these weren't ordinary predators. They were something older, something primal. The jungle had harbored these creatures for centuries, and now, in the dead of night, they had come to claim the souls of anyone who dared enter their domain. Another roar ripped through the night, and one of the creatures leapt into the air, crashing into Carter. He screamed as the beast dragged him into the trees, his cries fading into the distance. "Carter!" David shouted, but it was too late. The jungle swallowed him whole. The remaining soldiers fired wildly into the darkness, but their desperation was palpable. The beasts were relentless, their attacks calculated and precise. The men were no match for them. "We can't stay here." Reynolds yelled, his face pale with fear. "We have to retreat." David's mind raced. Retreat meant exposing their backs to the creatures, but staying meant certain death. He glanced at the remaining men, their faces filled with terror, their breaths ragged. "Fall back," David shouted, making the decision. "We'll regroup at the outpost." The soldiers scrambled to their feet, moving quickly toward the path they had come from. The creatures howled in fury, chasing them through the trees, their glowing eyes never leaving the fleeing patrol. The jungle blurred around them as they ran, the ground uneven and treacherous. David's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, barely able to keep up with the others. The roars of the beasts grew louder, closer. Just when David thought they wouldn't make it, they burst through the trees and into a small clearing. The old watchtower stood at the center, its structure crumbling but still standing. It was their last refuge. The men stumbled inside, slamming the door behind them. The creatures roared outside, clawing at the walls, their fury palpable. For now, they were safe, but David knew the night was far from over. The watchtower creaked as the wind howled outside, carrying the roars and growls of the creatures hunting them. Inside, the remaining soldiers huddled together, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their rifles still clutched tightly in trembling hands. The wooden walls of the tower felt fragile, as if they would shatter under the relentless assault of the beasts. David, his back pressed against the cold, splintered wall, tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night Jackson, Carter, and the others taken by the monsters that roamed the jungle. The weight of their loss hung heavily on him, but there was no time to mourn. Survival was all that mattered now. Reynolds paced back and forth, his eyes wide with panic. "We can't stay here. Those things will tear this place apart. We need to find a way out." David glanced at the barricaded door, the growls and scratching from the other side growing louder. "Out where? We're surrounded. If we run, they'll pick us off one by one." "Then what?" Reynolds snapped, his voice rising. "We sit here and wait for them to break through. We're dead either way." "Calm down," David ordered, though the fear in his own voice was hard to suppress. He scanned the small room, looking for anything that could help them. The watchtower was old, abandoned long ago by whatever forces once controlled the area. Dusty crates lined the walls, filled with nothing but rotting supplies and rusted equipment. The tower shuddered as something massive slammed against the outside wall. The soldiers jumped, eyes wide, as the creatures let out a low, menacing growl. Whatever they were intelligent, taunting their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Reynolds is right, Carter, who was barely holding himself together, muttered under his breath. We can't stay here all night. They'll get in eventually. David thought quickly. There's one more option, he said, voice low but resolute. The tunnel system below the tower. I remember hearing about it. The old Viet Cong used it during the war. It might lead us far enough away from this area to escape. Reynolds blinked, hope flickering in his eyes. You're serious. There's an exit. If the tunnels are still intact, David said, but it's a gamble. A series of loud bangs reverberated through the wooden walls, each one shaking the fragile structure. The beasts were getting more aggressive, testing the tower's defenses. We don't have much time, David said, already moving toward the floorboards in the center of the room. Help me lift this up. Together, the remaining soldiers pried open the rotting boards, revealing a narrow entrance leading down into the darkness below. A foul, musty smell wafted up from the tunnel, but it was their only chance. One at a time, David ordered, lowering himself into the opening. His feet touched the cold, damp earth below, and he clicked on a flashlight, illuminating the narrow passage. The tunnel walls were made of crumbling brick and dirt, slick with moisture, but it stretched forward into the unknown. The others followed quickly, one by one descending into the tunnel. Just as the last man was inside, a deafening crash echoed from above. The beasts had broken through. Hurry, David urged, motioning for the men to follow. He led the way down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing through the confined space. The air was thick, filled with the scent of decay and mildew. The deeper they went, the more the jungle seemed to close in around them. For what felt like hours, they moved through the winding passage, their nerves fraying with each step. Every sound, every gust of wind seemed to carry the creature's growls with it. David could feel the weight of the jungle pressing down, the spirits of the fallen soldiers still lingering, their anger palpable. We're being followed, Carter whispered, glancing over his shoulder. The tunnel behind them was pitch black, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. David stopped, listening intently. There, in the distance, faint but growing closer, the same rhythmic thumping they had heard before, like footsteps in the dark. The creatures were not far behind. Keep moving, David said, pushing forward. We're almost out of here. But the further they went, the stranger the tunnel became. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, the bricks shifting in the dim light of the flashlight. Shadows danced on the edges of their vision, fleeting figures that vanished when they turned to look. Then, they came to an abrupt stop. The tunnel had collapsed ahead, the exit blocked by tons of dirt and debris. No, Reynolds muttered, his voice barely a whisper. No, no, no. We're trapped, one of the others said, panic rising in his voice. What now, Dave? David's mind raced. He looked back the way they had come. The growls were closer now, the creatures closing in on their position. We can still fight them off, he said, gripping his rifle tightly. Set up here. Watch both directions. We hold our ground. As the men prepared for what seemed like their last stand, the tunnel around them grew colder. A chill ran down David's spine as he heard a faint, ghostly whisper. It was a voice human, but distant. Don't stay here. David whipped his flashlight around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Did you hear that? He asked, his breath quickening. Reynolds nodded, his face pale. Yeah, what the hell is that? Before anyone could respond, the tunnel filled with a cacophony of eerie whispers, like the voices of the dead, swirling around them. The air grew thick with the smell of blood and decay. "David," Carter said, his voice barely audible. "I don't think it's just those creatures. This place, it's cursed." David knew he was right. The jungle had claimed the lives of countless soldiers during the war, and their spirits had never left. Now, they were trapped in a place where the living and the dead were intertwined, and there was no escape. "Prepare yourselves," David said, his voice grim. "Whatever's coming, we face it together." And then, from the darkness, the glowing eyes of the creatures appeared, closing in on their position. The tunnel walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and oppressive as the glowing eyes of the creatures edged closer. David could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of death pressed against them from all sides. The beasts growled low, the sound reverberating through the earth beneath their feet, shaking the walls with an unnatural force. David took a deep breath, raising his rifle, and whispered to the men, "This is it. We make our stand here. Hold your ground." Reynolds, Carter, and the rest of the squad tightened their grips on their weapons, forming a defensive line. The tunnel felt like a tomb now, with no way forward and no way back. They were surrounded by the unseen presence of the jungle's forgotten dead and the snarling creatures stalking them in the dark. The shadows writhed and twisted, distorting the walls as if the jungle itself was alive, moving around them. Cold whispers echoed in the air, barely audible over the growls. David's flashlight flickered, casting brief, haunting glimpses of the creatures. They were closer now, hulking figures with eyes glowing like embers, their massive forms barely distinguishable in the darkness. David could feel his hands trembling, but he steadied himself, aiming at the nearest pair of glowing eyes. "Wait for it," he muttered under his breath. "Wait for the right moment." The tension was unbearable, the stench of decay thick in the air, suffocating. Then, without warning, one of the creatures lunged from the darkness, its jaws wide and eyes burning with an unnatural fury. David squeezed the trigger, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The beast recoiled, letting out a guttural howl as it fell to the ground, writhing in pain. "Fire!" David shouted, and the tunnel erupted in a hail of gunfire. The men unloaded their magazines, shooting at every glowing set of eyes they could see. The creatures howled and snarled, their massive forms thrashing in the dark, but they kept coming. Suddenly, Carter screamed, "Behind us, they're coming from the rear." David whipped around, his stomach dropping. Another group of creatures had emerged from the tunnel behind them, their glowing eyes flickering in the darkness as they closed in. "We're surrounded?" Reynolds yelled, firing blindly into the mass of approaching beasts. The men were caught in the middle, with no escape. The creatures were relentless, their massive claws raking across the ground as they charged. One of the soldiers was dragged into the shadows, his screams cut short by a sickening crunch. David's mind raced. The tunnel was collapsing around them, the walls vibrating as if something ancient and evil was awakening beneath the earth. He could hear the voices again, those whispers, now louder, pleading and warning them to leave, but there was no way out. "Hold the line," David shouted, but the words felt hollow. The squad was being torn apart, their defensive position crumbling under the weight of the supernatural onslaught. Then, something shifted, the air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. The creatures paused for a moment, their growls fading into low murmurs as if they, too, could feel the change. The tunnel itself seemed to groan, the bricks and dirt shifting unnaturally. Suddenly, the ghostly whispers grew louder, and the temperature plummeted. It felt as if a presence was rising from the earth itself, something far more ancient and powerful than the creatures haunting them. The men were frozen in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. From the depths of the tunnel, a figure appeared, ethereal and faint, like a wisp of smoke. It was the spirit of a soldier, long dead, his eyes hollow but filled with a deep sorrow. His presence was overwhelming, and the creatures backed away, growling in fear. The ghostly figure spoke in a voice that echoed through the tunnel. sounding both distant and near. "This land is cursed. You must leave." David could barely breathe as he watched the spectral soldier approach. "We can't," he stammered. "There's no way out." The ghost looked at him, his face etched with pain and suffering. "There is one way, but it requires a sacrifice." David felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The ghost's hollow eyes bored into him. "One of you must stay behind. Only then can the others leave this place." The remaining soldiers exchanged horrified glances. The growls of the creatures grew louder again, their patience wearing thin. Time was running out. "No," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "We're not leaving anyone behind." "We have no choice," Carter shouted, his voice filled with panic. "It's the only way." David clenched his fists, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked at the men, his comrades, his friends, and knew that one of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice if they were to survive. "I'll do it," David said quietly, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The men stared at him in shock. "No, David," Reynolds said, stepping forward. "You can't." David shook his head, his eyes filled with determination. "It's my responsibility. I led us here. I'll be the one to stay." The ghostly figure nodded, acknowledging David's decision. The creatures growled, inching closer, their patience wearing thin. The men could feel the presence of death all around them. "Go," David said, his voice firm. "Get out of here while you still can." The remaining soldiers hesitated for a moment, but they knew there was no other way. One by one, they turned and fled down the tunnel, following the path the ghost had revealed. David watched them go, his heart heavy but resolute. As the last soldier disappeared into the darkness, David turned to face the creatures. The ghostly figure stood beside him, its presence a cold comfort. "You will be remembered," the ghost said softly, before vanishing into the mist. David stood alone, the growls of the creatures echoing all around him. He raised his rifle one last time, knowing that this was the end. But he would not go down without a fight. And then, the tunnel collapsed, sealing his fate beneath the earth forever. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.